Okay, everyone, good evening and welcome to our Centenary Series, September 1921, the War of Independence. So again, this is a hybrid. I'm hoping the sound is good. I don't have any way of checking that because I'm by myself. So just let me tune in 1 second to Facebook to make sure that you can hear me. And then I'll get right to it. I'm not sure if there's sound. There is. Okay, great. Okay, good. So we have sound. So I'm just going to share my presentation with you guys and then we'll start. So September 1921, there are three main areas that I'll focus on for tonight's talk. The situation in the north, which was getting still, progressively more violent. The debate surrounding who should even be on the delegation being sent to London, and the back and forth correspondence between Lloyd George and De Valera in the build-up to these talks. So the delegation would start, would attend, thank you, Jennifer, in October. So there is no doubt that both sides were under pressure because at times during this month of September, it looked like there would be no hope for the talks even to take place. The delegation was contested within Sinn Féin and the cabinet, as well as the wider Dáil or Parliament. And even the terms of agreeing to meet were in dispute. There was the omnipresent threat of violence, even though there was a sort of tacit acknowledgement on both sides that a return to violence was not palatable for either side, and largely not even really possible on the Irish side. So all of this looms over the correspondence between the two heads of state. We already saw, just to start off, the cruel irony of the truce in July and the de-escalation of violence elsewhere on the island was that it heralded in actually a particularly vicious summer of violence in the north. In Belfast, IRA attacks on police often sparked harsh reprisals against Catholics who found themselves unprotected by the British government. The truce's promise of peace attracted suspicion on the main from in the north. Historian Alan Parkinson wrote in Belfast's Unholy War, The Troubles of the 1920s, Unionists feared that Republicans, quote, were merely using the ceasefire as a breathing space and an opportunity to redeploy IRA forces from the south and west into the north. Unionists expressed concern that the truce would negate the results of partition, forcing Ireland's reunification and undermining their security and identity as loyal British citizens. So we know, the Parliament had already opened and they were meeting. So partition was, to be honest, a fait accompli at this stage. In May 1921, Collins had been elected member for Armagh. He came second to the Unionist Richard Best. Like all of the other Sinn Féin men who were successful in that election in 1921, he did not take his seat in the Stormont Parliament. They were abstentionists. But he did pay a visit to the city on the 4th of September in what the Irish News described as his first official visit to the city. The implication being perhaps that he had been in Armagh an IRA business in the past, but he was now a leading figure in the Dáil Éireann cabinet. In fact, apart from appearances in the Dáil, this was the first time that Michael Collins had appeared in public since his name became known to the world as Commander-in-Chief of Republican forces. 4 months had elapsed since the election. So Collins was not obviously going up there to thank Sinn Féin voters. More than likely, he wanted to, as the Freeman's Journal put it, show that if Sir James Craig and his colleagues want to do business, and according to Lord Londonderry, peace is as vital for the north as the south, he is a man with whom business is possible. So, he was kind of reaching out to the community. There he is on stage in Armagh. Negotiations had begun already between Downing Street and Dáil Éireann, and partition was a tense subject. So Collins may have wanted to utilize his northern status as an MP to try maybe to make peace overture and to get publicity for both his own and the Dáil's viewpoint. This kind of softly approach that they were trying to take with the north. The Ulster Gazette's view was that he was in Armagh ostensibly for the purpose of addressing his constituents in Armagh, but really the occasion was one for an elaborate demonstration of the strength of Sinn Féin in mid-Ulster. And this would kind of come up in correspondence with Lloyd George about, whether or not partition was something they could kind of maintain. Both Collins and Owen O'Duffy addressed a reported crowd of about 10,000, including a large force of IRA men. Collins' speech was conciliatory towards the Unionists, but O'Duffy threatened, quote, if necessary, to use the lead on them. For his remarks, O'Duffy was removed as the Northern Truce liaison officer and replaced by Frank Crumley. So as I mentioned, there was kind of this acknowledgement about the North, and in a letter in early September to De Valera from Lloyd George, he acknowledged that counties Fermanagh and Tyrone in particular had a very weak case on the issue of forcing these two counties against their will to be part of Northern Ireland, basically because of the population of Catholics in both of those counties. Then on the 11th of September, De Valera received nationalist delegations from counties Down, Derry, Antrim, and from the city of Belfast, who were also anxious about partition. Referring to the Unionists, one Protestant member of the Belfast delegation said that partition would place power in the hands of those responsible for the pogroms. So we saw, kind of earlier on in the summer, particularly around June and July, many Catholics had been forced out of their homes. There had been those shipyard kind of riots and stuff earlier on. And so those are the pogroms that he was referring to. And of course, not all Unionists at the time, or not all nationalists, were Catholic. And in fact, there was a lot of division in the North between even Ancient Order of Hibernians and IRA. There's some interesting kind of work done on that. So between the 5th and the 18th of September, there were riots, quite a few riots in Belfast. 2 Protestants were killed by a sniper, 2 women, Maggie Ardis and Evelyn Blair, who were both 22 years of age. They were killed in Vere Street. And these 2 pictures, it's the same picture, but it was a bit tidied up. Apparently, even though there was actually quite a lot of Catholics living on the street, they said that they had to knock holes in the walls at the rear of the houses so people could enter and leave by the yard instead of out on the street, because the street at the front was actually so kind of heavily shelled by snipers. 2 other women had been wounded several days previously, and the streets had been swept with machine gun fire throughout September. Apparently, Vere Street, this one in particular, was regarded as the toughest street in Belfast. The incidents early in September appear to have attracted the press, and they saw that these photographs that I'm showing, the tunneled backyards. In these riots in Belfast, again, another grenade was thrown at a loyalist mob, advancing towards a nationalist area where 2 were killed and more than 20 injured. And on the 25th of September, an IRA volunteer was killed by a loyalist mob. A civilian was killed by a stray RUC bullet, and another civilian was killed by a grenade thrown into his home. So violence in the North, particularly in Belfast, was continuing really unabated, even as the Irish and British governments were desperate to agree to terms for a second round of negotiations after De Valera's failed efforts that summer. That's David Lloyd George. There was a growing sense of panic among the Irish contingent that terms would not be reached at all, as is evidenced by this 7th of September letter to an Irish diplomat in Rome. I got this on the Department of Foreign Affairs website, and I forgot to note who wrote the letter, but he said, with reference to the point about being kept informed, it's very difficult, as outside the ministry, nothing is known but what appears in the press. At the moment of writing, no one knows whether it is to be peace or war, but another day or 2 will tell whether there is to be a peace conference or not. So, people kind of outside of the immediate circle of De Valera were a little bit tense, and there was clear signs, that letters were going back and forth between both countries, but kind of there was no movement. So the Dáil were negotiating, both as a Dáil and the more private kind of cabinet were talking about who would go as delegates. David Lloyd George and De Valera were engaged in a painstaking effort to agree conditions for the negotiations to even begin to take place. So I'm going to read, from some of these letters just so you'll see them. There's Cathal Brua. I put him there because he was in contestation for to be a delegate. Of course, he's Minister for Defence. And there's Michael Collins, who, we said before, like this was kind of his outing. They weren't very clear. The British weren't very clear what he looked like prior to this. And so he felt, he'd given up his sort of secret identity, and he was a little bit nervous about that. That's the delegation from Ireland. I'll come back to that. So, so this is one of the first letters from Lloyd George asking the Irish government, you know, telling them about the talk. So the only thing I really wanted to kind of highlight here was that this correspondence has been going on all summer since De Valera had come home. You know, there's this kind of wink and nod language about diplomacy versus maybe implied threats. So I've highlighted a section to decline to discuss a settlement which would bestow upon the Irish people the fullest freedom of national development within the empire can only mean that you repudiate all allegiance to the crown and all membership of the British Commonwealth. If we were to draw this inference from your letter, then further discussion between us could serve no useful purpose and all conference would be in vain. If, however, we are mistaken in this inference, as we still hope, and if your real objection to our proposals is that they offer Ireland less than the liberty which we have described, that objection can be explored at a conference. Now, I mean, there's so much going on in those few sentences, but you kind of wonder what's the point of having a conference to explore if they've already said, you know, in the sentence beforehand, like, we're not giving you the liberty that you're asking for. And I suppose my point about these letters was, I think it was fairly obvious from the start what the British government were or were not willing to compromise on. And I really kind of don't think that anyone on the Irish delegation should have been under any illusions about, you know, what they were going to gain. And the interesting thing is this last sentence that I highlighted, you know, I want you to just remember the phraseology here. His Majesty's government must therefore ask for a definite reply as to whether you are prepared to enter a conference to ascertain how the Association of Ireland with the community of nations known as the British Empire can best be reconciled with Irish national aspirations. And so, you know, if you answer in the affirmative, I suggest the conference should meet at Inverness on the 20th instant. So this was very early September, the 7th of September. Now on the 12th, I'm going to read this letter to you. So, you know, I just read the letter that one of the Irish TDs had written to the papal envoy around the same time as that letter, the 7th of September. On the 12th, De Valera replied to David Lloyd George. He said, "We have no hesitation in declaring our willingness," and he quotes him back to himself, "to enter a conference to ascertain how the Association of Ireland with the community of nations known as the British Empire can best be reconciled with Irish national aspirations. Our readiness to contemplate such an association was indicated in our letter of August 10th. We have accordingly summoned Dáil Éireann, the Parliament, that we may submit to it for ratification the names of the representatives it is our intention to propose. We hope that these representatives will find it possible to be at Inverness on the date you suggest, September 20th. In this final note, we deem it our duty to reaffirm that our position is and can only be as we have defined it throughout this correspondence. Our nation has formally declared its independence and recognizes itself as a sovereign state. It is only as the representatives of that state and as its chosen guardians that we have any authority or powers to act on behalf of our people. As regards the principle of government by consent of the governed, in the very nature of things, it must be the basis of any agreement that we will achieve the purpose we have at heart, that is the final reconciliation of our nation with yours. We have suggested no interpretation of the principle save its everyday interpretation, the sense, for example, in which it was understood by the plain men and women of the world, when on January 5th, 1918, don't forget World War I, you said the settlement of the new Europe must be based on such grounds of reason and justice as will give some promise of stability. Therefore, it is that we feel the government, with the consent of the governed, must be the basis of any territorial settlement arising out of this war. So that was that kind of principle of self-determination that, you know, they were hoping to bring to bear for countries like, you know, Poland and Czechoslovakia after World War I. So De Valera is using the British words against themselves. These words are the true answer, i.e. British words, are the true answer to the criticism of our position, which your last letter puts forward. The principle was understood then to mean the right of nations that had been annexed to empires against their will to free themselves from the grappling hook. That is the sense in which we understand it. In reality, it is your government, when it seeks to rend our ancient nation and to partition its territory, that would give to the principle an interpretation that would, quote, undermine the fabric of every democratic state and drive the civilized world back into tribalism. So, you know, on the one hand, he's accepted the terms, and he quoted about the, you know, best reconciled with the Irish national aspirations, and yet he's attempting again to go backwards and redefine, you know, what that relationship between like two equal kind of nations would look like. So on September 13th, Harry Boland and Joseph McGrath were sent to Scotland with De Valera's letter. Lloyd George technically offered to consider the letter undelivered so that it wouldn't stall talks, and he tried not to accept it. He telegraphed De Valera saying that if he accepted receiving that letter, it would mean recognition of Ireland as a sovereign state, and he couldn't do that. De Valera published the letters, which kind of caused consternation on the British side, and Lloyd George called a cabinet meeting at Inverness to discuss the crisis. But in the meantime, Harry Boland and Joseph McGrath wrote to Eamon de Valera on the 14th of September about Lloyd George's response to that letter of the 12th of September. And this is very interesting, I think. President, as directed by you, we proceeded to and arrived at Gairloch on Tuesday, 13th inst at 3 o'clock. Mr. Lloyd George was away. He returned at 5:20 and we presented your reply. While he appeared in very good humour and remarked when taking the reply, I hope you have brought something definite this time. He changed immediately when he read it and said it won't do. I can't have it. Why did he put in that second paragraph? He, De Valera, said that on each occasion I saw him. He said it in public. Why could he not leave it at that? I am done. I am done. Up to this, no opportunity had presented itself for my mentioning your difficulties, etc., to his secretary, Grigg, as per your direction. So by way of replying to Lloyd George, I pointed out that his last reply was of such a nature that you were driven to reply as you had done. And even with that, you expected grave opposition from the Dáil, perhaps even a reverse note. He replied, I know, but since the opening up of negotiations, I have given way each time against the wishes of my supporters, but De Valera has not moved an inch. In the case of a big and small nation, the big nation should not have to give all and get none. No, I have dealt with all nations, all men, Mr. Clemenceau, Mr. Briand, etc. We all have to give something, but De Valera will give nothing. I am done, done. He left with his secretary asking us to remain. After 5 minutes, he returned and said, I can't accept that. I am indeed very sorry. You had better wire Mr. De Valera saying the conference is off. Now, I don't know if you remember our July talks. This was exactly the cat and mouse kind of game that they played. Oh, sorry, that's it. That they played at the time then as well. You know, De Valera insisting on kind of his definition of Dominion status and external association. So they're used to this kind of brinkmanship, you know, with each other over basically like semantics, you know. But the point is, Lloyd George is the head of a coalition government. You know, he's a Liberal government, the last Liberal leader to actually be in charge of Parliament over there. Like the Liberal Party fails, and it's Labour and Conservatives that emerge after 1922. So, you know, he's in a very tenuous domestic position. So he said, you will get no British statesman to accept that. No British statesman dare. I have received already a protest signed by 60 of my supporters protesting against my having gone so far. Grigg received a letter from a very influential and respected personage protesting. Why all peoples, all papers, with the exception of the Bulletin, favour acceptance? We, says Boland, pointed again to your great difficulties. He replied that he knew them well. He said, I know all the different elements De Valera has to deal with, and it was because I knew I worded my reply in such a way. I even used his own term, association, to help him mind you that was not in the first draft. So, like, you know, Lloyd George says he's compromised. He again glanced at your reply and said, why could he not see it? I can't say what I think, but it is hell. Consent of the governed is all right. I don't mind that. He has a good score off me there. But the other, I can't have sovereign state. No. I can't go into conference and treat as I would with France, for instance. I can't even call cabinet on it. I can do nothing except ask him to withhold publication, or if you like, I will give you back the reply. And I can only answer it by declaring off the conference. We asked time to consider, says Boland. Having consulted, we decided not to take back your reply, but we told him we would stop publication. The question of our visit arose, and we agreed on a communique. He said he would accept it without the second paragraph, and if you agreed that you could hand your reply to Cope. He was one of the civil servants in Dublin Castle. If he had received it by Friday, the conference could come off on Tuesday. If Saturday, he suggested Wednesday. So Lloyd George is, fully anticipating kind of that the conference would begin almost the following week. After some further discussion on details re the conference, we parted. I wired publicity not to publish announcement about the handling of the reply and explained as best I could with safety on the phone from Inverness what had happened. So Dáil Éireann met at 11 a.m. on the morning of September 14th. The Cabinet's reply to the British Prime Minister's letter was read and approved. De Valera announced that he would not go to talks, and Cathal Brugha, Austin Stack and Robert Barton supported him in that, as did a number of the women, for instance. And he was opposed in that by Griffith, Collins and Cosgrave. Now, it didn't matter, the women didn't matter, that comes up in the Dáil. This is just the Cabinet, the actual Parliament. So it was 3 kind of for De Valera staying and 3 against, because Griffith, Collins and Cosgrave wanted him to go. And it was De Valera's own vote that cast it, that he would stay at home. So De Valera did play the most decisive role in selecting the delegates who were to travel to London to conclude the treaty. In a way, his selections actually served to impede progress and almost guaranteed stalemate among the Irish themselves. By refusing to go himself, De Valera offered many reasons why it would be best for him to remain in Dublin. Perhaps most interesting among these was his desire to preserve his status as a symbol of the Irish Republic. He did not feel that it was prudent to be present at negotiations that would require the surrender of the Republic. He stated it is vital at this stage that the symbol of the Republic should be kept untouched and that it should not be compromised in any sense by any arrangements which it might be necessary for our plenipotentiaries to make. So it appears from his own words there that he did not anticipate the possibility of the negotiations ending in a way that would secure a republic. He kind of knew there would be this massive compromise needed, and he sent others in his place to do that unpleasant deed of brokering Ireland's future. His argument was it left him in a position to criticize and direct without maybe being directly responsible for an unfortunate outcome. He wished to prevent any hasty decisions by remaining in reserve, because he thought it would allow the delegates to claim that they must first consult De Valera before they made any final commitment. But that was a strategy which would fail spectacularly in the end, in the face of Lloyd George's ultimatum on the 6th of December. He felt that his influence was needed in Dublin in order to persuade staunch Republicans like Cathal Brugha and Austin Stack to accept the inevitable compromise and to act as a unifying figure. So, it's possible that De Valera remained in Dublin for those reasons, but there may have been the more selfish reason behind the decision of knowing that he could not get anything but a compromise which would not be popular. Collins in particular strongly objected to himself being sent. He felt that as a soldier, he had fought a war. It was not his position to negotiate the terms of a treaty. He stated that the task of being a delegate was a loathsome one, and that he went in the spirit of a soldier who acts against his judgment on the orders of a superior officer. I think his words were, "You are my chief, and if you tell me to go, I will go, but you know and I know I cannot bring back a republic." So there was even a debate about the plenipotentiaries. Who were they receiving their powers from was a sticking point. Would it be the Cabinet or the entire Dáil? De Valera is recorded as, and this was so funny because it kind of changed in that month between late August and late September when they actually agree. De Valera was recorded in the minutes as saying, either give them a free hand to the plenipotentiaries or we would tie them up. If we tie them up, they would get no one to go. That was his opinion, quote. He said, none of them present wanted to betray Ireland. The men or women who would be appointed would be men and women who served Ireland and who would be entitled to our confidence. He said no man or no woman could go over to negotiate in the conditions in which they were under the terms as not full plenipotentiaries. What he was simply asking was that they confine themselves to one or two things in this debate. Either let the cabinet appoint the plenipotentiaries without ratification by the House, or ratify them, but do not tie their hands by anything more than they had to be tied themselves by the British government. He said they cannot be tied into a knot by our own people at home. The plenipotentiaries should have a certain amount of freedom. If the Dáil wanted war, then do not send them at all, unless you want negotiations from the point of view of marking time. They had to remember that this was a time they could pass over the opportunities that came in their way, and as people responsible for the country, they had to do the best they could for the country, and they could not do that if they tied up the hands of their plenipotentiaries. He would oppose it, tying their hands, to the extent of resigning. So, he's trying maybe to bring along some of the people who wanted to not call those who were negotiating the treaty plenipotentiaries full of power. Some people wanted them only to be kind of, negotiators that would have to revert to Dublin for every decision. Again, in the September debates, he said on the record, and these are from the Dáil minutes, De Valera, he said, knew fairly well from his experience over in London how far it was possible to get the British government to go. Very interesting statement. And when they came to that point, they would have to deal with the matter in a very practical manner. So De Valera is acknowledging there is a limit to what Britain will give us, and the plenipotentiaries are going to have to be practical then. To be in the very best position for the possibilities of a breakdown, and to be in the best position to deal with those questions as they would arise, and not to be involved in anything that might take place in those negotiations, to be perfectly free. He asked the cabinet not to insist on his going as one of the deputation. They would understand that the Minister for Foreign Affairs, Arthur Griffith, should be chairman. There was a question of whether they should send the delegation at all, but he took it that the approval of the letter meant that the Dáil would approve of the delegation going. So, he's absolutely aware that if they were trusting these diplomats to go and negotiate, that they were going to hit a stone wall. Now, Cosgrave, who was Minister for Local Government, strongly argued against this. He, quote, maintained the president should be one of the delegation. He had an extraordinary experience in negotiations, and he had the advantage of being in touch already. He was the only one corresponding with Lloyd George. The head of the state in England was Mr. Lloyd George, and he expected that he would be one of the plenipotentiaries on the side of England. He pointed out, Cosgrave pointed out, this was a team they were sending over, and they were leaving their ablest player in reserve. Now, it was not unusual to leave the ablest player in reserve. The reserve would have to be used sometime or other, and it struck him that now was the time that the best player was required. He formally moved that the president be chairman of the delegation. De Valera replied, he really believed it was vital at this stage that the symbol of the Republic should be kept untouched and should not be compromised in any sense by any arrangements which it might be necessary for our plenipotentiaries to make. He was sure the Dáil realised the task they were giving those plenipotentiaries to win for them what a mighty army and navy might not be able to win for them. It was not a shirking of duty, but he realised the position and how necessary it was to keep the head of state and the symbol untouched, and that was why he asked to be left out. So again, with this question of plenipotentiaries and power and, how much independence they would have, De Valera is clear as mud in his answer. He said he understood plenipotentiaries were people who had power to deal with a question subject to ratification. They would go first with a cabinet policy, and on the understanding that any big question should be referred home before being decided by them. So he sets up that limit first. You're going with subject to ratification. And of course, the big question was, partition and kind of sovereignty. That was the Irish delegation's bigger issues. But he continues in the same speech. They wanted plenipotentiaries, to use the word plenipotentiaries, to give to the world the impression that they were being sent over with full powers, to do the best they could to reconcile the Irish position with the British position. They should have full powers, because if they go over, They needed to have the moral feeling of support of the position to do the best they could for Ireland. So he's telling them, you are going to have to come back for ratification. He's saying, he acknowledges that we need to put out the appearance of plenipotentiary, because that word is very important and it looks to the world, we're giving this impression, and that they morally needed the support. So were the plenipotentiaries going to be allowed to accept, the terms without ratification, or were they supposed to revert to Dublin? And unfortunately, that's what the whole thing hinged on during the treaty debates. Seamus Robinson brought up, he was TD for Waterford, interestingly enough, that there was no representative of the army on the delegation, because don't forget, Michael Collins was Minister for Finance officially in the government. And he said, did the cabinet consider the advisability of having the Minister for Defence, Cathal Brugha, on the delegation? Brugha said quite calmly, there was no necessity for him to go. He had more useful work to do in Ireland at the present time. The representatives whom they were sending were bound by the replies already given. Which is interesting because, to be honest, we know he did not run the War of Independence, even though he was the Minister for Defence. So, he was kind of allowed to sidestep that, even though he was kind of one of the most diehard Republicans in the cabinet. So this final group here, chosen by De Valera, were a group of men who so differed on their opinions of how the treaty should be concluded that they were unlikely to agree on any of the important issues from the outset of negotiations. The Irish delegation was to consist of Arthur Griffith acting as chairman, Michael Collins as second in command, Robert Barton as the economic expert, Gavin Duffy and Eamon Duggan were both lawyers, and then Erskine Childers and John Charters were acting as secretaries without a vote. It was well known that of the cabinet, Cathal Brugha was a diehard Republican and favoured a return to war rather than a compromise. So, maybe you should negotiate with a man like that, right? And that Austin Stack shared similar views. Both of these men remained in Dublin. It was equally well known that Griffith and Collins did not stand by the idea of the Republic so resolutely. Collins, in particular, would have been well aware of how absolutely limited a return to war on their side would have been. De Valera stated in a letter in late December 1921 that he knew Griffith would accept the crown under pressure. So he already knew, that Griffith would probably cave on the issue of maybe sovereignty or an oath of allegiance, that kind of thing. De Valera nominated Childers to go in the hopes that he could persuade his cousin Barton. So don't forget, Childers is a non-voting member. He's the secretary, but Barton was a delegate, and they were very close. Childers, De Valera hoped, would hold Barton to the course of the Republic, and maybe that in turn would check any willingness to compromise that might reside in both Griffith and Collins. So De Valera's logic behind the selection of these delegates really is doomed in a way to intentional hindering of any progress. He didn't expect Griffith and Collins to stand their ground on the Republic. He left it up to Barton and to Childers, two of the men who had the least influence on the entire delegation. In fact, Barton wouldn't even be included in some of the talks that only Griffith and Collins went to. So those were the men he was entrusting to secure a Republic. On the eve of these negotiations, he assembled a team of delegates headed by two men that he knew would compromise because of their fear of returning to war. So the Dáil approved this delegation, with Collins again protesting on the record, and he gave the delegation plenipotentiary status. And that is, as I said, one of the kind of sticking points later on in the treaty debates. The cabinet instructions given to the delegates before they left stated that all major decisions and the final text of the treaty would have to be referred back to the cabinet in Dublin. But the cabinet could not limit powers that were conferred by the entire Dáil, by the entire government. And so those instructions, to be honest, were interpreted, particularly by Griffith, as just being a kind of a guideline, because they could not be held. Those were not the conditions under which the vote was taken, So Griffith was saying, this kind of secret, the cabinet of seven is asking us to come back, but the Parliament gave us full rights as plenipotentiaries. So they've already maybe lost before they go. Now the correspondence. So I think we already read that letter. Yeah. So De Valera's mishandling, basically, and the complications of the negotiations began before the Irish delegation had even been, fully formed on the 14th, and certainly before they got to London. And this kind of back and forth continued throughout the deliberations. Between the truce of July 1921 and the beginning of official negotiations in October, De Valera and Lloyd George's letters, broke up semantically the idea of brokering this peace. In his letters to Lloyd George, De Valera expressed a willingness for peace, but placed in the way several obstacles kind of continually, with this insistence that, quote, our nation has formally declared its independence and recognized itself as a sovereign state. Lloyd George rejects that idea every single time it's presented, rejects that they are meeting under those terms, because to do so would involve disloyalty to the throne and empire. So the goal of the negotiations was to determine, as he offered in August, how the association of Ireland with the community of nations known as the British Empire may best be reconciled with Irish national aspirations. With that exchange and De Valera's eventual capitulation on the self-recognition idea, and I'll come to that letter in a minute, Lloyd George maintained the British stance that Ireland would not be recognized as an independent republic while they were negotiating these terms. And De Valera accepted that, thereby failing to protect the idea of the republic as an equal negotiating partner. The formal invitation sent to De Valera spoke of reconciling Irish national aspirations with membership within the Commonwealth, and mentioned nothing of two independent political equal entities negotiating a settlement. So by accepting even the invitation as written, De Valera had technically surrendered already one of the most important points before the two delegations even met, whether he realized it or not. And you can be guaranteed Lloyd George realized it. Lloyd George's absolute stubbornness on the issue of association and the Crown were indicative of how these further discussions were going to play out, because he made it clear from the outset that there was no ground to be given to the Irish. I think the correspondence between Lloyd George and De Valera revealed the absolute impossibility of compromise coming from Lloyd George. Aside from the fact that he had seen this already firsthand when he attempted to negotiate with him over the summer, De Valera was under no illusions about what type of agreement, if any, that the Irish delegation would get. And I think that his own stated desire to be held in reserve in case talks would break down was kind of a red herring. Lloyd George, and we'll go through some of these letters now, pulled no punches in his replies. And really, it was only through a kind of a deliberately selective reading of Lloyd George's last letter to him that the Irish president agreed to go into the talks. So this letter from the 19th of September from Lloyd George, from De Valera to David Lloyd George, he says, "We have had no thought at any time of asking you to accept any conditions precedent to a conference. We would have thought it as unreasonable to expect you, as a preliminary, to recognize the Irish Republic formally or informally, as that you should expect us formally or informally to surrender our national position." Like, that's just kind of a non-entity. Like, so he absolutely says we acknowledge that you're not calling us a republic, but we're still going to call ourselves that. It is precisely because neither side accepts the position of the other that there is a dispute at all, and that a conference is necessary to search for and to discuss such adjustments as might compose it. A treaty of accommodation and association properly concluded between the peoples of these two islands, between Ireland and the group of states in the British Commonwealth, would, we believe, end the dispute forever and enable the two nations to settle down in peace, each pursuing its own individual development and contributing its quota to civilization by working together in free and friendly cooperation in affairs of agreed common concern. To negotiate such a treaty, the respective representatives of the two nations must meet. Again, like all these words, nations, if you seek to impose preliminary conditions, which we must regard as involving a surrender of our whole position, they cannot meet. Your last telegram makes it clear that understandings are more likely to increase than to diminish, and the cause of peace more likely to be retarded than advanced by a continuation of the present correspondence. So he's kind of sidestepping, like he's acknowledging we're not going to agree, so we might as well get down to the talks. But if you know you're not going to agree in writing, why do you think you're going to agree to something in person, We request you, therefore, to state whether your letter of the September 7th is intended to be a demand for surrender on our part or an invitation to a conference free on both sides and without prejudice should agreement not be reached. If the latter, we readily confirm our acceptance of the invitation and our appointed delegates will meet your government's representatives at any time in the immediate future that you designate. Now, there's one other thing that has to be mentioned that was putting pressure on Lloyd George, and I already said about his coalition Liberal government. On the 24th of September, Winston Churchill gave a speech in Dundee. He was Minister for Dundee, Member of Parliament for Dundee. He asserted that the most immediate threat to the empire lay in Ireland, where a truce between Sinn Féin and Britain in the War of Independence had already been declared in July. So this talk to this audience in Dundee was very kind of politically astute of him. And don't forget, he's eventually one of the negotiators on the team, on the British team. Reconciliation was kind of the theme of this talk. He said that past quarrels had to be put aside, and this included, he stressed, differences between the Conservatives and the Liberals themselves on how to deal with Ireland. But if the message was reconciliation, his tone was very firm. In its offer of Dominion status to Southern Ireland, because he's taking partition as done, the government had gone, he said, to the utmost limit possible. So Dominion status, to be like Canada. So far, the negative response of Eamon de Valera, Sinn Féin's leader, he said, had been disappointing and puzzling. True, he was riding a nationalist tiger, that was a quote, and allowances had to be made for that. So, this acknowledgement that de Valera is trying to keep various entities in Sinn Féin together. Nonetheless, Churchill told his audience that he was uncertain where the Irish leaders stood. Quote, "I only know where we stand. We have reached the end of our tether." The audience in Dundee cheered. He added a sobering note by raising the prospect of an independent Irish Republic and what that would mean. He painted a dark and ominous picture of what could lie ahead. A fortified frontier between North and South, with hostile armies on each side, constant fear that the Irish Republic was intriguing with other countries against Britain, possibly by giving them submarine bases, a tariff wall between the two nations, and hundreds of thousands of Irishmen living throughout the empire immediately being declared aliens if war broke out between Britain and Ireland. Quote, "What a ludicrous and what an idiotic prospect is unfolded before our eyes. What a crime Sinn Féin would commit if they condemn themselves and their children to such misfortunes." To head off this dark future, he says a conference was clearly needed. It would be wise to be outspoken and foolish to encourage false or dangerous hopes. It had to be a successful conference. Squander it, he warned, in words clearly designed for the ears of de Valera, and peace is bankrupt. His final words linked Ireland's fate to his broader vision for Britain. Quote, "When in moments of doubt or hours of despondency, we fear that the course of events we are pursuing towards the Irish Sinn Féiners is repugnant to some of our feelings, we must cheer ourselves by remembering that a lasting settlement with Ireland, a healing of the old quarrel, a reconciliation between the two races, would not only be a blessing in itself inestimable, but with it would be removed the greatest obstacle which has ever existed to Anglo-American unity, and that far across the Atlantic Ocean, we should reap a harvest sown in the Emerald Isle." So I think Churchill is really laying out the feelings of most of the British government. Of course, he's in the Conservative Party, and as I say, he is appointed to be a delegate on the British team. But he's absolutely, not one for breaking up the Commonwealth and that association, and he does not intend for partition to mean a division on the island of Ireland, even though he's 100% behind the northern state, still flourishing. So that speech has now been issued on the 24th up in Dundee. And so Lloyd George tries one last time on the 29th of September with De Valera. His Majesty's government have given close and earnest consideration to the correspondence which has passed between us since their invitation to you to send delegates to a conference at Inverness. In spite of their sincere desire for peace, and in spite of the more conciliatory tone of your last communication, they cannot enter a conference upon the basis of this correspondence. Notwithstanding your personal assurance to the contrary, which they much appreciate, it might be argued in future that the acceptance of a conference on this basis had involved them in a recognition which no British government can accord. On this point, they must guard themselves against any possible doubt. There is no purpose to be served by any further interchange of explanatory and argumentative communications upon this subject. This is a short letter and he's really let them have it. The position taken by His Majesty's government is fundamental to the existence of the British Empire, and they cannot alter it. My colleagues and I remain, however, keenly anxious to make, in cooperation with your delegates, another determined effort to explore every possibility of settlement by personal discussion. The proposals which we have already made, our endeavours for reconciliation and settlement are no empty form, and we feel that conference, not correspondence, is the most practical and hopeful way to an understanding such as we ardently desire to achieve. We therefore send you herewith a fresh invitation to a conference in London on October the 11th, where we can meet your delegates as spokesmen of the people whom you represent, right? So nothing about sovereignty, nation, republic. And look at the phrase, with a view to ascertaining how the association of Ireland with the community of nations known as the British Empire may best be reconciled with Irish national aspirations. So in a month of correspondence and dilly-dallying and semantic fact-checking kind of with De Valera, Lloyd George has not moved 1 inch from the letter he originally sent in August. Their intentions for the talks is exactly, that last sentence is exactly the offer he made in August. So there was absolutely no movement on the behalf of the British. He did not acknowledge the Republic. He did not change what they were offering, and that has to have been plain to everybody on the Irish side, I think, whether you were a delegate or not. And De Valera responds the next day. So like no delay of 1 or 2 days as there had been previously, literally the next day. Sir, we have received your letter of invitation to a conference in London, and he quotes him. So he's showing he understands, with a view to ascertaining how the association of Ireland with the community of nations known as the British Empire may best be reconciled with Irish nationalist aspirations. Our respective positions have been stated and are understood. Now, that's maybe two different things, because what was stated and what De Valera is pretending that he understands, which is that he is, the figurehead of an Irish Republic and a self-determination nation, that Lloyd George has stated he's not acknowledging that. So, it's one thing to claim that both positions were understood, but Lloyd George's plain black and white is saying we don't agree to that. So he says, we agree that conference, not correspondence, is the most practical and hopeful way to an understanding. We accept the invitation, and our delegates will meet you in London on the date mentioned to explore, again a quote, to explore every possibility of settlement by personal discussion. So now it's interesting, in his letter there, he's called them delegates and not plenipotentiaries. This is kind of leaving him that wiggle room for later on. Now, the reality is neither side really had a choice about the necessity for these talks. The letters could have gone on for another year and they wouldn't have probably made any more headway. So they understood they had to meet in person. There had to be a talk, because if you allowed the correspondence to continue, it would eventually just degrade into threats, which is, to be honest, what happens in the actual negotiations anyway. Both sides have very clear objectives for their own teams. As early as July 1921, the British had set out the main issues of concern to them: membership of the British Empire and the Commonwealth, recognition of the Crown, naval defence, trade, and financial obligations owed by Ireland to Britain. For the Irish, sovereignty and Irish unity were the crucial issues, but by now the former, sovereignty, had come to overshadow unity because partition was a reality. So, the Irish side is kind of wobbling already. The Dáil cabinet had agreed to seek an outcome suggested by De Valera, which he had already tried himself and which had failed miserably, that Ireland would be, quote unquote, an external associate of the states of the British Commonwealth rather than having dominion status. This had already been flatly rejected, and yet, that's his instructions to the team kind of kept going. The willingness to accept any relationship or recognition of the Crown depended on the Irish securing British commitments on the essential unity of Ireland. And, what did the essential unity of a country mean when 6 counties were already partitioned and self-governing? So it looks like both sides were kind of prepared to offer concessions. Each recognized that the other had genuine concerns about some of the issues that they would be negotiating. Sovereignty was the central issue for both sides, but on opposite sides. The Irish negotiators wanted to secure a deal in which Ireland would be independent, possibly keeping some link to the British Empire if a united Ireland could be obtained. And as I said, the united Ireland kind of lagged a little bit. The British wanted to maintain the integrity of an empire that, unlike most of its counterparts, had emerged victorious and complete, after World War I. Complete independence for a large portion of what was then the United Kingdom was not acceptable to the British, and neither was the idea that Ireland could become semi-detached from the empire in this external association idea. So the stage was finally set in September for negotiations to take place in London, with the delegation who were not fully agreed on what their role as plenipotentiaries were, with the delegation who really did not agree on what the priorities of negotiation should be, and with the cabinet who were not fully behind them. I can't think that anyone on the Irish side was confident going into these talks. So that's September. Now, if anyone has any questions on Facebook, let me just check. You can, ask questions and I'm here. It was a tough month. It's very difficult, I think, to kind of keep in mind, for later on, because the treaty debates are so sort of heartbreaking and so personal. But I kind of think the compromising was already done. It's impossible, I think, not to read those letters from Lloyd George and from De Valera, and even the treaty debates. Like, you can actually go online, the treaty debates, some of them are available online, in those minutes. Sorry, not the treaty debates, the debates about the correspondence and the debates about the plenipotentiaries. And it's amazing how long, these are. Like, they go well into the night. People can't agree on the definition, are they delegates or are they plenipotentiaries? They actually are so kind of heated that the chairman has to keep saying, like, you're out of order, there's a motion on the floor already, we have to table this motion. It's a very, even though, of course, minutes are kind of a dry record of things, the fact that they're constantly interrupting each other. And then, as I say, what the cabinet says and what the wider Dáil say, particularly, Countess Markievicz is in there. The women, Padraig Pearse's mother is in there, saying things about whether or not they have the right to negotiate, whether they should come back. And the priorities, the big split on the Irish side is, should we go for sort of sovereignty of the 26 counties, or are we going to try to undo partition? And, there was absolutely no way that partition could be undone. De Valera has already met, don't forget, Carson and Craig once and once only in June or July. He'd already met Lloyd George and come back with nothing. So, you know, it's kind of a heartbreaking task, I think, that these men are sent out on. And it's really not a surprise, I think, that Griffith in particular, you know, dies of a stroke really just kind of months later, you know, early August of 22. So if there are no questions, we can leave it there. Next month, we're going to look, of course, at October, which is, you know, they're into the negotiations, and you can't help but think the poor men are outflanked really on not just, you know, kind of diplomatically, but maybe the fact that all of these compromises have already been made, even if they're not acknowledging that they've made, you know, the compromise. So I just think this delegation are going into something that they really have very little confidence in, and they sort of know that they're not going to be supported by those at home, because what everybody wants is already clearly not going to be, you know, given to them. Rita, yeah. So the difference between a delegate or the plenipotentiary, that's exactly it, Rita. Plenipotentiary, I remember my high school teacher telling us this, basically is a, you know, Latin word for full of power. And so this was really, it was kind of indicative of how much splitting hairs the Irish government were doing themselves, because they are interchangeably referred to as plenipotentiary, and that is actually on the official kind of letter, you know, that they're given. So this means they are given full power to negotiate and ratify a treaty on behalf of the Irish government. This was the understanding that certainly, you know, kind of Griffith went with, because I said the larger Dáil, the Parliament, agreed to use that term and that definition of full power, whereas sort of privately, the cabinet, which was only 7 of them, had said they would be delegates, and that, or they could use the word plenipotentiaries because they had to feel that they had the moral support of the country. But De Valera had kind of insisted in these debates that they should know to come back, and to kind of, they could use that as the excuse, you know, that, oh, we've got to go back and ratify everything in Dublin. So we don't have full power to negotiate and conclude a treaty. We just are the intermediaries, and we've got to bring everything back to Dublin. Now, whether De Valera thought that would actually work, I'm not sure. Like, it's interesting, in his last letter there, he does call them delegates, but certainly they're given papers that call them plenipotentiaries. You know, you just wonder, like, it depends, I guess, on how cynical you are. You know, did De Valera purposefully kind of keep that up in the air a bit so that he could use it against them later on, when he said, like, you had no right to sign this treaty because you were only delegates? But at the same time, you know, he's on record in the minutes as saying they needed to be plenipotentiaries. They needed to be able to have the status to finalize the talks. So I think it's just, you know, to cover himself, maybe. Like, I think it gives him the luxury of disavowing their signatures later. Maybe he thought they would revert. Maybe he thought the fact that Barton and Childers were on the delegation, you know, that they could kind of hold off. He certainly expected to be reported to. And you know, Michael Collins does all the way through, as we'll see next month in November. They are reporting back. But the final night, you know, is they signed the treaty in the middle of the night, 2:00 in the morning, they signed the treaty. So this idea of having to go back when Lloyd George kind of accuses them of being remiss in their role, I think is not something that they were able to defend. You know, I think the fact that they were called plenipotentiaries meant they had to sign. Welcome, Rita. So there's a few more of you on. Does anybody else have a question, guys, or a comment? I'm glad you could hear me loud and clear. That's great. We invested in a microphone, but sometimes I'm not sure if it's connected or not. To be honest, when you're one-on-one like this on the computer, actually, it's never bad. The sound is never bad. So I'm finalizing the October calendar. I know our next talk is October 5th. We've got an author and an ex-TFA agent, Wayne Miller, coming from Boston to discuss Boston Burn. It was a series of arson attacks in Boston in the 80s, maybe the 70s and 80s. we're holding that in person here, but we'll also kind of stream it out. I'll do my October talk. We have a Zoom only or an online only talk with a lecturer from Trinity College Dublin about Irish Gothic. Later on in October, we'll have Toss the Feathers doing the next installment of the Collars, Canals and Conflagration series, where they'll sing kind of songs about the Civil War and canals and all of that, you know, to talk about the Irish experience up here. And there'll be a few other events too. They're not kind of fully finalized. So thank you everyone for tuning in. I'm hoping that nobody is asking questions that I'm ignoring, but I can't seem to see any new comments. So I'm hoping you're all satisfied. Good, Rita. Yeah, we're delighted to do it. I think, you know, this series in particular has been very interesting for me because I think it's such a huge topic, the War of Independence. So to be able to break it down into the month, you know, kind of and see the gradual progression, I think is much more interesting than, you know, trying to condense 2.5 years into, you know, a couple of talks. Jim, great, no problem. Oh yeah, Jim, I forgot. We've got Jim tomorrow. Jim Kennelly, Professor Kennelly from Skidmore College is coming down to give us a very interesting talk about Horace Plunkett and the cooperative creamery movement. And it's so funny because an ancestor or a descendant of Horace Plunkett has turned the estate, Dunsany estate, into this kind of re-greening, you know, kind of natural habitat. So he's in the news a lot, but that's going to be very interesting. Horace Plunkett, of course, was a big kind of, you know, home rule, I guess, supporter, certainly an independent Ireland, even if it was only economically. And yet, you know, we'll see he's not well supported by the War of Independence. And in fact, the property is burnt. So that's tomorrow at 7 o'clock. I'll see you tomorrow, Jim, that's for sure. So thanks, everyone. Have a great night and keep an eye out for our newsletter. I shared earlier on today, I was on the Adrian Flannelly radio show on Saturday. So I shared just my part of the of the program because, you know, it was about a 40-minute long interview. So that's on our page. Yeah. So Jim said Plunkett was very close to Barton and to Erskine Childers, which will, you know, come up again later on in the month. So you can watch that. And of course, don't forget, we've launched our 35 for 35 campaign. The museum turned 35 this month, founded in 1986. So all year you have the opportunity to donate $35 or some factor thereof if you would like to support our mission. You know, we're delighted to be able to offer these talks free and of course strongly believe that our museum mission should be accessible and open and available, but we do need your support to be able to continue to do that. So thanks everyone, and tune in later on tune in tomorrow for Professor Kennelly's talk. Thank you. Take care, everyone.